So, those are one-part song forms. All right, let's go back and look now at the handout. So go back to handout and scores, and then back to song form handout. And two-part song forms. Either part is from a phrase to a double period in length. So this could be as many as 8 phrases. And this includes, it can be as short as a contrasting period, so it has to be at least 2 phrases in length, with each phrase then being a part. So the antecedent phrase would be part 1. So if you had this phrase construction, this would be a 2-part song form. Part 1 would be, and then part 2 would be that. And so that's very simple and basic, and so that's the shortest example of a 2-part song form. And this form includes contrasting periods, so that's what this was, and contrasting double periods. Also, it includes phrase groups that have these different types of possibilities, A prime B, A, B, B prime, or A, B, C. When you have this type of situation, we're going to see an example here in a second, which is God Save the Queen, or My Country 'Tis of Thee. Those are the same melody. And this opening phrase is 6 measures in length. So that's going to be part 1. It does not have the return of this opening phrase. So it's not going to be a 3-part song form. But it does have this element of contrast. It's kind of arbitrary that we're going to have part 2 then as the last 2 phrases. But the phrase construction would be a single phrase for part 1, and then part 2 is a contrasting period. So, phrase groups belong in that type of situation. Obviously, if you have a situation where you have A prime B, then part 1 would be a parallel period. Part 2 would be a single phrase. Or if you have this situation, then part 1 would be a single phrase. Part 2 would be a parallel period. So those are some different possibilities for 2-part song form. And you can use the term extended or expanded. So I have listed here expanded 2-part song form, and that is used when you have the use of repeats around either or both parts. So let's say you have something like this. And then you have that. So if you're looking at the whole thing, then you see that all of these together would be contrasting double period, but you're going to analyze this as part 1. This will be part 2, and because you have the repeat signs, and you could just have it around the first part and not have repeats here, and you would still call it expanded two-part song form. So, these are examples that are similar to binary form, which in general, binary form will be longer. So, like if you have a movement of a Bach suite, it typically, can be longer than this. But those terms are similar for sure. But we're going to use these definitions for our two-part song forms. So if you go back to the examples, then on the second page of the examples, at the top of the page, I have there a two-part song form that is a contrasting period. And so part one would be a single phrase. Part two is contrasting, and it is a single phrase. So that's that little tune from Spain. And then number 5 is the one I was talking about with the God Save the Queen, where you have a 6-measure opening phrase, which equals part 1, and then you have 2 4-measure phrases, which are, all the phrases in this are contrasting. So it looks like it's a phrase group that is A, B, C, but we're going to have A is part 1, and then part 2 is B and C. And in this example, this was 6 measures long, and so, as I said, it's arbitrary the way that you group those. But that's how that's traditionally viewed. Number 6, then, is a 2-part song form that is more like this one. And it's not exactly the same as far as the parallel phrases and stuff. But the first 2 phrases are parallels. You have A prime, and then that's repeated. And then you have B prime, and so that should be an expanded 2-part song form. So you want to use that term expanded. I don't have that written on there, but that's you'd want to use that term because of the repeats on that. All right, the next type is incipient 3-part song form. This is the only one that is always 4 phrases in length. So it's the most specific of any of these song forms. So we'll put here always 4 phrases in total. So I will definitely ask you to define this on the next test, this second test, which will cover song forms and then minuet, trio, scherzo trio. So the situation with this, incipient is something that is coming into full fruition. So it's not quite completely formed yet. And so what this refers to is that it's like a 3-part song form. So the basic idea of 3-part song form is that let's write this down here. So in parts 1 and 3 are the same material. So it's like ABA, okay? So it's like a rondo idea, it's just shorter. And so That is the main thing that you want to hold on to, is that parts 1 and parts 3 are the same. Okay, so in an incipient 3-part song form, part 1 is either a parallel or a contrasting period. All right, so it's like this or like this. So I'm going to draw up here 2 examples. Part 2 is a single phrase. Usually it's contrasting. And then part 3 brings back one of the phrases, only one phrase, but it brings back one of the phrases from part 1. So, in this example, part 1 is a parallel period, part 2 is contrasting, so that's just a single phrase. Part 3 could bring back a, so it brings back this phrase, or it could bring back a prime. So we'll put here a or a prime, so it could be. So those are both examples of incipient 3-part song form. And same deal. With the situation where you have a contrasting period for part 1, it will either bring back the first phrase or the second phrase. But that's why it's called incipient, is that it doesn't bring back the whole part 1, it just brings back one of the phrases. So I'm going to underline that twice. It brings back one of the phrases. Okay, so it's always 4 measures in length. And so you have these kinds of patterns. These are some, typical constructions. You can even have a situation where it might bring back the beginning of the first phrase and then the end of the second phrase. And so it just would combine those, elements from both of those. It's still a single phrase in length, but you could have that situation. And we're going to see that in just a moment. So, if you will now go back to the examples of song forms and look at this example of an incipient 3-part song form, the one that is by Stephen Foster, Old Folks at Home, Swanee River. And so you have, in this situation, 4 phrases in total. This one has a repeat around the first 2 phrases. So it's not unusual that you would have repeat signs around part 1, or you could have repeat signs around parts 2 and 3, or you can have repeat signs around both part 1 and parts 2 and 3. You usually don't have repeats around parts 2 and then repeats around part 3. Usually it's going to view it, like in 2 overall sections as far as the use of repeat signs go. But Old Folks at Home has an opening phrase that looks like a half cadence. It's in D major, so it looks like that's your cadence on a dominant chord there in measure 4. And then the second phrase is parallel. So the the first two measures are exactly the same, and then the third measure is slightly different, and you have an authentic cadence at the end of the second phrase, and then that's repeated. Then the third phrase would be part two. So far we've had this, A prime, and then actually it's going to be exactly like this one right here, where you have a contrasting third phrase, so that starts right after the double bars. And then it brings back that second phrase, so the one that has the authentic cadence, to conclude. And so that's an example of incipient three-part song form. Then the next example is constructed exactly the same way. It is the theme from the last movement of the Beethoven Ninth Symphony, the Ode to Joy theme. And so, same key even. So you have opening four measures, half cadence. The second four measures is parallel, and it's an authentic cadence. And then you have a third phrase that is contrasting. And then the fourth phrase brings back the second phrase. So again, it's this same situation. This brings back one of these two, so it brings back that second phrase. And that is another example of incipient three-part song form. All right. The final example is, and we'll see a lot of examples of this, it's a typical way of constructing a theme, like in a rondo movement. You know, the rondo A theme might be composed that way. That it would be four phrases in total in this incipient three-part construction. So this last example is from the last movement of the Mozart D major sonata. It's Crucial 284. And this is an example that has 12 variations in this particular movement. It's the longest movement of the Mozart piano sonatas. But this theme is constructed in incipient three-part song form. So I'm going to play this example of it as you look at the score here. And this, let me pull that up real quickly. All right, so we're going to hear this opening theme. Okay, so that is the end of the first phrase. And you hear how that had a half cadence. What we're going to hear in the second phrase is that it modulates to the key of dominant, so A major. So you're going to see the G sharps there by the time you get to measure 6, the second measured phrase. And then you have an authentic cadence, and you can see how that's a delayed authentic cadence, how it has a suspension from the last two notes of the second to last measure, so of measure 7. And then, but in the bass, you hear the A major chord on the downbeat, and then in the right hand, it resolves on the second beat. So that suspension is a non-harmonic tone that makes it a delayed cadence. All right, so let's hear that second phrase. So that was part one. And so this was a situation where if you look at the beginning of each phrase, even though they're exactly the same rhythm, you probably call it contrasting because it goes in the opposite direction. The melody, it's an inversion. The ascending eighth notes in the first full measure then in the consequent phrase is descending, so contrasting period there for part one. All right, now in the second half of it, we have